The morning light filtered through our kitchen window as I carefully wrapped David's birthday gift, my hands trembling slightly, not from excitement, but from the familiar knot of anxiety that had become my constant companion over the past 2 years. Tonight would be David's 35th birthday celebration, and despite my excitement to see my family, I couldn't shake the dread that had settled in my chest like a stone. Michael was already downstairs, the sound of ice clinking against glass echoing up the stairs. It was barely 10 in the morning, but the drinking had started early today. I told myself it was just nerves about the party, that he wanted to be social and relaxed around my family. Deep down, I knew better. "Emma, are you ready?" His voice called from below, already carrying that slight slur that I'd learned to recognize as the first warning sign. "Coming," I replied, forcing brightness into my voice as I smoothed my dress one final time. I'd chosen it carefully, a deep burgundy that I knew looked good on me, hoping it might remind Michael of the woman he'd fallen in love with 5 years ago, the woman who used to laugh freely, who used to believe in her own worth. The drive to David's house was tense. Michael gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his knuckles white against the leather. I watched the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood pass by, each turn bringing back memories of birthday parties filled with laughter and warmth. My family had always been close, protective of each other in ways that both comforted and intimidated outsiders. "Remember, my mom's been asking about your promotion," I said quietly, trying to fill the silence. "She's excited to hear about the new position?" Michael's jaw tightened. "Yeah, well, some of us actually have careers to talk about." The words hit like a physical blow, but I'd learned not to flinch visibly. Instead, I turned toward the window, watching the world blur past as tears threatened to spill. There was a time when Michael had been proud of my work as a social worker, when he'd bragged to his friends about how I was making a difference in kids' lives. That was before the drinking got worse, before every conversation became a competition I was destined to lose. We pulled into David's driveway, and I could see the warm glow of lights through the windows. My sister-in-law, Rachel, had outdone herself with the decorations, and I could already hear the sound of laughter from inside. For a moment, I felt a spark of the old me, the sister who belonged here, who was loved unconditionally. "Try to have fun," I whispered to Michael as we walked to the door, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to him or myself. David opened the door with his characteristic grin, pulling me into a bear hug that lifted me off my feet. "There's my favorite sister," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm your only sister." I laughed, feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. "Details," he waved dismissively, then turned to Michael with a more reserved but still friendly handshake. "Good to see you, Mike." The house was full of warmth and familiar faces. My parents, my aunt and uncle, David's college friends, and several neighbors who'd become like family over the years. Rachel had prepared an incredible spread of food, and the dining room table was laden with all of David's favorites. It was the kind of celebration that should have filled me with joy, but instead, I found myself monitoring Michael's alcohol intake with growing concern. During the cocktail hour, I watched him down 3 beers in rapid succession, his voice growing louder with each drink. When my mother asked him about work, his response was sharp and dismissive. When my father tried to engage him in conversation about sports, Michael barely looked up from his phone. "Is everything okay?" Rachel asked quietly, appearing at my elbow with a concerned expression. "Of course," I replied automatically, the lie coming easily after so much practice. "Michael's just tired from work." But Rachel knew me too well. We'd been close since she married David 8 years ago, and she'd watched me change over the past few years. Her eyes held a knowing sadness that made my chest tighten. Dinner was announced, and we all gathered around the beautifully set table. David sat at the head, glowing with happiness as he looked around at all the people he loved. I felt a pang of envy at his contentment, remembering what it felt like to feel truly at home in my own skin. The conversation flowed easily around the table. Stories from David's childhood, updates on family friends, gentle teasing about his advancing age. I found myself laughing genuinely for the first time in weeks, caught up in the warmth and familiarity of being surrounded by people who loved me. That's when Michael's voice cut through the pleasant chatter like a blade. "Well, at least some of us have something to celebrate," he said, his words slightly slurred but clearly audible to everyone at the table. The conversation gradually died as people turned to look at him, uncertain about his tone. I felt my stomach drop, recognizing the particular set of his jaw that meant trouble was coming. "What do you mean?" my father asked carefully, his protective instincts already sensing a threat to his daughter. Michael took a long sip of his wine, seeming to enjoy the attention. "I mean, it's nice to see success in the family. Not everyone can say the same." The table had gone completely quiet now, the only sound the soft jazz music Rachel had playing in the background. I felt every eye on me, and I wanted to disappear into the floor. "Michael," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Please don't." But he was beyond listening now, fueled by alcohol and whatever resentment had been building inside him. "Don't what? Tell the truth? Tell them how their precious Emma hasn't accomplished anything worth talking about? How she spends her days dealing with other people's problems because she can't handle her own?" The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. I could feel the shocked silence around the table, could see my mother's face pale with horror, could sense David's growing anger. "She's so busy trying to save everyone else's kids that she can't even figure out her own life," Michael continued, his voice rising. 32 years old, and what does she have to show for it? A job that barely pays the bills, and a marriage she's too scared to face. I wanted to defend myself, to stand up and tell him he was wrong. But the words wouldn't come. Years of this kind of treatment had worn me down, made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just fooling myself about making a difference. "Michael, that's enough." David's voice was deadly quiet, but I could hear the anger building underneath. "Is it?" Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I don't think anyone here knows what it's like to be married to someone so useless." The word hung in the air like a curse, and I felt something inside me shatter. Useless. In front of my entire family, the people who had loved and supported me my whole life, my own husband had called me useless. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, could feel the tears threatening to spill over. But more than that, I could feel the collective intake of breath around the table, the shared shock and outrage of people who knew me, who valued me, who saw something in me that I'd forgotten how to see in myself. David stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. My brother had always been protective of me, but I'd never seen him look like this. His face was flushed with anger, his hands clenched at his sides. "Get out," he said quietly. "What?" Michael blinked, as if suddenly realizing where he was and what he'd done. "I said get out of my house." David's voice was getting louder now, and I could see our father starting to rise from his chair as well. "You don't get to sit at my table and talk about my sister like that." "Oh, come on." Michael waved dismissively. "I'm just being honest. Someone needs to tell her the truth." That's when David snapped. "The truth?" he shouted, moving around the table toward Michael. "The truth is that my sister is one of the most compassionate, intelligent, dedicated people I know. The truth is that she's helped dozens of kids find better lives, that she's made a real difference in this world. The truth is that you're a drunk, who's too insecure to appreciate what he has." Michael stood up unsteadily, his face reddening with anger. Don't you dare! Don't I dare what? Tell the truth? Isn't that what you were doing? David was standing directly in front of him now, and I could see the years of watching his sister shrink and fade, boiling over into pure rage. You think you know everything about our marriage. Michael's voice was rising to match David's. You think your precious sister is so perfect. She's weak, she's needy, she's... He never got to finish the sentence. David's fist connected with Michael's jaw with a sound that made everyone gasp. Michael staggered backward, knocking over his chair, wine spilling across Rachel's beautiful tablecloth. For a moment he looked stunned, his hand going to his face. Then he lunged at David. What happened next was chaos. The two men grappled in the dining room, knocking over a lamp and sending dishes crashing to the floor. My father and uncle rushed to separate them, while my mother pulled me away from the fray. I could hear Rachel on the phone with someone, probably calling the police. But through it all, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a sense of being defended, of being worth fighting for. David was willing to risk everything to protect my dignity, to stand up for me when I couldn't stand up for myself. When they finally separated the two men, Michael's lip was bleeding, and David's shirt was torn. The birthday party was over, the celebration ruined, but something else had been born in that moment of violence and chaos. Emma? My mother's voice was soft, but firm as she held me close. You don't have to go home with him tonight. You can stay here. I looked around the room at my family. My parents, my brother, my sister-in-law, my aunt and uncle, all of them looking at me with expressions of love and concern. For the first time in years, I saw myself through their eyes instead of Michael's. I don't know, I whispered, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. I don't know what to do. You don't have to decide tonight, Rachel said gently, appearing at my other side. But you need to know that you have options. You have people who love you. Michael was being escorted out by my father and uncle, his face a mask of anger and wounded pride. As he passed me, he grabbed my arm roughly. Come on, he said. We're leaving. But something had changed in me during that confrontation. Maybe it was seeing the shock and horror on my family's faces. Maybe it was the way David had fought for me. Or maybe it was finally hearing out loud just how little my own husband thought of me. No, I said quietly. What? Michael's grip tightened. I said no. My voice was stronger now, and I pulled my arm free. I'm not going with you. The look of surprise on his face would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. I don't think it had ever occurred to him that I might refuse, that I might choose my family over him. Emma, get in the car right now, he demanded, his voice carrying that tone of authority that had worked so well for so long. But I was surrounded by people who saw my worth, who believed in me, who had just witnessed what my marriage had become. Their strength flowed into me, filling some of the empty places that years of emotional abuse had carved out. I'm staying here tonight, I said, my voice growing more confident with each word. I need to think. Michael's face cycled through several emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally, something that might have been fear. For the first time, he was facing the possibility that his control over me might be slipping. Fine, he said finally, his voice cold. But don't come crying to me when you realize you've made a mistake. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving us all standing in the wreckage of what should have been a celebration. But as I looked around at the concerned faces of my family, I didn't feel like it was an ending. It felt like a beginning. I'm sorry, I said, the words coming out in a rush. I'm so sorry about tonight, about ruining David's birthday, about bringing this into your home. Stop, David said firmly, crossing the room to put his hands on my shoulders. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. But the party, can be celebrated again tomorrow, or next week, or whenever," he interrupted. "What matters is that you're safe, that you're here with people who love you." I looked around the room again, taking in the overturned furniture, the broken dishes, the wine stains on the carpet. But I also saw my parents holding each other, tears in their eyes but determination on their faces. I saw Rachel already starting to clean up, not with resignation, but with the quiet strength of someone who understands that sometimes messes are necessary for healing. I saw my aunt and uncle looking at me with expressions of fierce protectiveness. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, the weight of years of suppressed doubt and fear finally finding voice. "I don't know how to be without him. I don't know who I am anymore." My mother crossed the room and took my hands in hers. "Sweetheart, you're the little girl who used to spend hours reading to the elderly residents at the nursing home when you were 12. You're the teenager who started a tutoring program at the community center. You're the woman who chose a career helping children because you couldn't bear to see them suffer. You're the person who never misses a birthday, who remembers everyone's favorite foods, who sends cards when people are sick," Rachel added. "You're the one who helped me plan this entire party because you wanted David to feel special. You're my sister," David said simply. "And you're stronger than you know." As they spoke, I felt something shifting inside me. Like a door that had been locked for years was finally creaking open. I began to remember who I was before Michael's constant criticism had worn me down. I remembered the satisfaction of helping a troubled teenager find their way, the joy of seeing a family reunited, the quiet pride of knowing I'd made a difference in someone's life. "The work you do matters," my father said quietly. "I've seen the letters from the families you've helped. I've watched you come home exhausted, but fulfilled, because you've given everything you have to help kids who need an advocate." "But Michael said—" "Michael is wrong," David interrupted. "Michael is a man who drinks too much and takes out his own failures on the person who loves him most. That doesn't make him right about anything." I thought about the children I'd worked with over the years. Kids from broken homes, kids who'd been abused, kids who'd been told they were worthless. I'd spent countless hours helping them see their own value, teaching them that they deserved love and respect. How had I forgotten to apply those same lessons to myself? "I think," I said slowly, the words feeling strange and new, "I think I need to stay here for a while. I need to remember who I am." The relief on everyone's faces was palpable, and I realized that my family had been watching me disappear for years, helpless to stop it. Tonight had been the breaking point, but it had also been the moment when they could finally step in and help me find my way back. "Stay as long as you need," Rachel said immediately. "We'll set up the guest room. I'll call your supervisor tomorrow," my mother offered. "Let them know you might need a few days." "I'll change the locks on the house," David added grimly. "And I'll make sure Michael knows he's not welcome here." As they bustled around me, making plans and arrangements, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind that had kept me holding on to a marriage that was slowly killing me, but real hope. Hope that I could rebuild my life, that I could remember how to value myself, that I could find my way back to the person I'd been before I'd lost myself in someone else's opinion of me. The next few days passed in a blur of difficult conversations, legal consultations, and emotional revelations. I called in sick to work, something I'd never done except when physically ill, and spent my time trying to piece together how I'd gotten so lost. My family has surrounded me with love and support, but they also gave me space to process what had happened. David apologized repeatedly for the violence, worried that his actions had somehow made things worse. But I assured him that seeing someone fight for me, seeing someone believe I was worth defending, had been exactly what I needed. "I forgot," I told him one evening as we sat on his back porch, watching the sunset. I forgot that I was worth fighting for. I never forgot." He replied, "None of us did. We just didn't know how to reach you." I thought about that, about how isolated I'd become, how I'd slowly cut myself off from the people who loved me, because Michael had made it clear that my relationships were a source of conflict. I'd chosen him over them, over and over again, until I'd almost lost them entirely. "I'm scared," I admitted. "I'm scared of being alone, of starting over, of failing." "Failing at what?" David asked gently. "At everything. At being independent, at being enough on my own, at proving that I'm not useless." David was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "You know what I think? I think you're scared of succeeding. I think you're scared of finding out that you're actually incredible, that you're capable of amazing things, that you've been holding yourself back all these years." His words hit me like a revelation. Maybe my fear wasn't about failure at all. Maybe it was about the possibility that I was so much more than I'd allowed myself to believe. Over the following weeks, I slowly began to rebuild my sense of self. I returned to work with a new perspective, throwing myself into my cases with renewed passion. I rediscovered my love for the work, remembering why I'd chosen this career in the first place. My supervisor, Sarah, noticed the change immediately. "You seem different," she said during our weekly check-in. "More focused, more confident." "I'm remembering who I am," I replied, surprised by the certainty in my own voice. It was true. With each passing day, I felt more like myself again. I started making decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what would avoid conflict. I began speaking up in meetings, sharing ideas I'd kept to myself for years. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Most importantly, I started believing in my own worth again. I remembered that I was someone who had chosen to dedicate her life to helping others, who had made a real difference in the world. I wasn't useless. I was someone who had been used and diminished, but who still had so much to offer. The divorce proceedings were difficult, but I faced them with a strength I'd forgotten I possessed. Michael tried to manipulate me, to convince me that I was making a mistake, that I'd never survive on my own. But I had my family behind me, and more importantly, I had myself. "You're going to regret this," he told me during one of our final conversations. "You'll realize that you need me, that you can't do this alone." "Maybe," I replied calmly. "But I'd rather try and fail than stay and disappear." The words surprised both of us. The Emma he'd married never would have said something like that. Never would have chosen uncertainty over security. But I wasn't that Emma anymore. 6 months after David's birthday party, I was sitting in my own apartment, a small but bright space that I'd chosen and decorated myself. I was reading case files, preparing for a court hearing where I'd be advocating for a young girl who'd been removed from an abusive home. As I read her story, I was struck by the similarities between us. She'd been told she was worthless, that she deserved the treatment she'd received, that she had no other options. But she'd been brave enough to ask for help, to believe that she deserved better, just like I had. I thought about that night at David's house, about the moment when my brother had stood up for me, when my family had shown me that I was worth fighting for. It had been the beginning of my journey back to myself, the first step in remembering that I was valuable, that I had something to offer the world. The girl in the case file reminded me of another truth, that healing is possible, that people can change, that it's never too late to choose a different path. I'd seen it in my work countless times, but I'd never applied it to my own life. Now, as I prepared to fight for this young girl's future, I realized that I was also fighting for my own. Every case I took, every child I helped, every family I worked with, was a reminder that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Dinner Sunday. David's making his famous chili. I smiled as I typed back. I'll be there. Can I bring anything? Just yourself, came the reply. That's all we ever wanted. As I set my phone aside and returned to my case files, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. The night that had seemed like my lowest point had actually been my salvation. The moment when I'd stopped accepting less than I deserved and started fighting for the life I wanted. I was no longer the woman who had sat silently while her husband humiliated her. I was someone who had found her voice, who had chosen to value herself, who had discovered that she was so much more than anyone else's opinion of her. I was Emma, and I was exactly who I was supposed to be. The court hearing went well the following week. I presented my case with confidence and passion, fighting for my young client with the same fierce determination that David had shown when he'd fought for me. The judge ruled in our favor, and the girl was placed with a loving foster family who would help her heal and grow. Afterward, as I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Not because I'd won a case, but because I'd remembered who I was. Someone who fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Someone who believed in the possibility of redemption and healing. Someone who knew that every person deserved to be valued and loved. The woman who had sat silently while her husband called her useless was gone. In her place was someone stronger. Someone who had learned that her worth wasn't determined by anyone else's opinion. Someone who had discovered that she was not only useful, but essential. I was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had found her way back to herself. And I was just getting started.